It's a story about something I've been hiding even from myself. One night, one meeting, and I couldn't turn back. You want to know how it ended? Then listen to this. Hello, my dear friends. In this story, I'm going to tell you about the strangest and most unexpected turn in my life. Make yourself comfortable, grab a cup of tea or coffee, and follow me all the way to the end. It's going to be hot, I promise. It happened about 5 years ago when I was living in a small house in a suburb of Portland, Oregon. My name is David, I was 38 at the time, and I was working as a manager for a local building materials company. My life was quiet, too quiet, and I often felt like I was just floating along. My wife Caroline was hardly ever home at that time. She was an accountant at a large firm in Seattle, and she was always traveling to meetings there. Sometimes she'd come back for the weekend, but more often I'd only see her through the screen of her phone. I'd gotten used to it over the years of marriage, but the loneliness still pressed down on me like a heavy stone. The house seemed empty, and I filled my evenings with watching TV shows or reading the news. Caroline always said her work was her passion, and I tried to support her, but inside I was struggling. Everything changed when her son from her first marriage, Nathan, came back to our house. He was 22, fresh out of college in Boulder, Colorado, and had decided to live with us while he looked for a job. Nathan was tall, with short dark hair and a calm look that made people feel comfortable. He was polite, helped around the house, and I noticed right away that he made it easier to tolerate the quiet. We could chat for hours about all sorts of things, sports, his plans, how he wanted to get a job at an IT company. For the first time it was simple and quiet, like he was a roommate. I cooked dinner, he did the dishes, and we sometimes watched old movies together. But after a couple weeks, I started noticing little things that confused me. For example, he might hold his gaze on me a little longer than necessary when I was explaining something, or accidentally touch my hand when he passed me salt at the table. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just thinking too much, but those moments stuck in my mind. One evening, about a month after his arrival, I was standing in my bedroom in front of the mirror. It was a normal Thursday. Caroline was back in Seattle, and I had decided to change after work. I took off my shirt and threw it on the chair and stayed in my t-shirt, looking at my reflection. I always thought I looked pretty good for my age trim, with a slight gray on my temples. But at that moment I wondered if anyone but the mirror could see me at all. The light in the room was soft, pouring in through the curtains from the streetlights, and I suddenly heard the door creak open. I turned around, holding the sweater I was about to put on, and saw Nathan in the doorway. His eyes widened, like he didn't expect to find me there, and he froze in place. "Oh, sorry, David, I didn't realize you were here," he said, stepping back. His voice sounded awkward, but there was something else in it that I couldn't immediately understand. My heart raced, and I felt my cheeks begin to burn with embarrassment. "It's okay, I was just getting changed," I replied, trying to speak calmly, even though everything was trembling inside. He nodded but didn't walk away. He stayed standing there looking at me. "I was going to ask about dinner, but I can come back later," he added, and his gaze slid over me before returning to my face. I swallowed, not knowing what to say, and just nodded in response. "Stay if you want, it's okay," I said suddenly, and I was surprised by my own words. Nathan smiled with the corner of his mouth and stepped back into the room. "Are you sure? I don't want to stress you out," he asked, and his voice was soft, almost cautious. I nodded, feeling the air between us grow heavier. "I'm sure, I'm even glad you're here," I said, and it was true. We stood in silence for a couple seconds, and I noticed him looking at me, not just looking, but as if studying me. "Are you okay, David? You've been kind of brooding lately," he asked, and his words caught me off guard. I opened my mouth to reply, but instead I just shrugged. "Yeah, I'm fine, just tired I guess," I lied, even though everything inside was screaming about how lonely I was. He stepped closer, and I felt the warmth of his presence. "If anything, I'm always here for you, you know," he said quietly, and his hand lightly touched mine as he turned toward the door. That moment only lasted a second, but it turned something in me upside down. I watched him walk away and realized that this was just the beginning of something I couldn't have predicted. And it scared the hell out of me. It had been about 2 weeks since the night Nathan had caught me in the bedroom. I still couldn't get that moment out of my mind, His eyes, his voice, the warmth of his hand when he touched me. Life in the house went on as usual. I went to work, Nathan looked for jobs, and Caroline called every couple of days to tell me how things were going in Seattle. But something had changed inside me, as if someone had flipped a switch that I didn't even realize was on. I began to notice Nathan more than I had before, and it confused me. One Saturday, I decided to do some cleaning work in the garage. The weather in Portland was cloudy but warm, and I thought that physical work would help me distract myself. Nathan volunteered to help, and I didn't mind. His company always made days like this easier. We were sorting out old boxes, moving tools, and I caught myself sneaking glances at him. He was wearing a simple gray t-shirt that was slightly tight around his shoulders, and I could see his muscles tensing as he lifted the heavy boxes. "Are you in good shape, Nathan? Do you work out?" I asked, trying to sound casual as I stacked the old magazines. He smiled, wiping the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "Yeah, I used to run in the mornings in college. The habit stayed," he replied, and his voice was so calm that I felt silly for my question. We continued to work, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he too sometimes looked at me longer than necessary. By lunchtime we were done, and I suggested we grab a bite to eat in the backyard. I got a couple of turkey sandwiches and a bottle of water from the refrigerator, and Nathan brought chairs from the kitchen. We sat under an old maple tree, and a light breeze moved the leaves over our heads. "Thanks for helping out today. It would have been boring alone," I said, taking a bite of my sandwich and looking at him. He nodded, looking somewhere off to the side. "I love spending time with you, David. You're always so calm," he replied, and there was something in his words that made my insides clench. Then something happened that I still can't quite explain. I stood up to put away the empty plates and tripped over a tree root sticking out of the ground. Nathan reacted instantly. He jumped up, grabbed my hand and held me so that I would not fall. His palm was warm and strong, and I felt my heart beat faster than usual. "Careful, David, I don't want you to break anything," he said with a slight smile, but he didn't let go of my hand right away. We stood like that for a couple seconds, and I noticed how close his face was to mine. "Thanks, I'm fine, just an awkward moment," I mumbled, trying to look away, but his eyes held me like a magnet. He slowly pulled his hand away but stepped a little closer, and I felt the warmth of his breath on my cheek. "Are you sure you're okay? You're all red," he asked quietly, and there was more concern in his voice than I expected. I nodded, but everything was boiling inside me. I didn't know what to do with this feeling that was growing by the second. "It's just hot today. I guess I'll go get a drink of water," I said, stepping back and trying to pull myself together. Nathan looked at me for another moment, then nodded and went back to his chair. "If anything, tell me, I'll get you some water," he added, and his tone was so soft I almost walked right back to him there. I went into the house, closed the kitchen door and leaned against the wall, trying to figure out what was happening to me. I avoided his gaze for the rest of the day, but I couldn't stop thinking about the way his hands squeezed mine. It was more than just helping something personal, something I didn't want to admit. I lay in bed at night, staring up at the ceiling and asking myself why I wanted him around again so badly. I knew it was wrong, that he was Caroline's son, that I was married, but these thoughts only confused me more. I felt guilty, but alive at the same time, as if for the first time in years. The next day Nathan left for a job interview downtown, and I was left alone. I walked around the house, trying to keep myself busy, but I kept coming back to that moment in the yard. His voice, his touch, it was like a splinter I couldn't get out. I knew I should keep my distance, but part of me wanted him to come back and look at me the same way again. And that was what scared me the most. It had been a couple months since that day in the yard, and I still couldn't figure out how I felt. Nathan had gotten a job at an IT company in downtown Portland, and his schedule had gotten tighter, but he still came home every night. Caroline came up for the weekend a couple of times, and I tried to act normal, cooking dinner, asking about her business, smiling when she told me about Seattle. But every time she left, I found myself waiting to be alone with Nathan. One Friday night I was sitting in the living room with my laptop, checking work emails. It was raining outside the window, typical of Oregon, and the sound of the drops on the glass calmed me down. Nathan came home later than usual, soaked to the skin, with a bag over his shoulder. The weather today was a nightmare, I almost drowned on the way home, he said, shaking the water out of his hair, and I laughed, looking at him. He looked tired, but his smile was as warm as ever. Go get changed, I'll make some tea, warm you up a bit, I suggested, closing my laptop and getting up from the couch. He nodded and left for his room, while I went to the kitchen, put the kettle on and got 2 mugs. While the water was warming, I heard him coming down the stairs and turned around. Nathan was in a dry t-shirt and shorts, his hair still damp, and he looked so simple, so homely, that something inside me gave me a twinge. Thanks, David, you always know how to save me, he said, taking the mug from my hands. We sat down at the table in the kitchen, and I noticed him looking at me over his mug. Tough day at work, huh? I asked, to fill the silence that had suddenly gotten too loud. He nodded, sipping his tea. Yeah, got a new project started, everyone's running around like crazy, he replied, and his voice sounded tired but calm. I looked at him and realized that I liked just listening to him, being around him, even if we were talking about nonsense. Then he suddenly fell silent and set the mug on the table. David, can I ask you something? He said, and his tone was more serious than usual. I tensed but nodded, trying not to show how much my heart was racing. Sure, ask whatever you want, I replied, looking into his eyes and sensing that something important was about to happen. He paused for a moment as if gathering his thoughts, and then he said, Are you happy with Caroline? I just see you alone here all the time. His question hit me like a cold wind, and I didn't know what to say. I opened my mouth, but the words stuck, and I just stared at him. I don't know, Nathan, it's complicated, I finally squeezed out, my voice shaking more than I wanted it to. He leaned a little closer, and I felt the warmth of his presence through the table. You deserve to be happy, David, you're too good to just wait, he said quietly, and his words were like a knife that cut through all my excuses. I swallowed, trying to pull myself together, but his gaze wouldn't let me go. What about you? Are you happy here with me? I asked, and my voice was almost a whisper. He smiled, but it wasn't an ordinary smile. There was something deep in it that I couldn't quite figure out. I feel better with you than I do anywhere else, he replied, and his hand slowly rested on mine on the table. His fingers were warm, and I didn't pull my hand away, even though I knew I should. We sat like that for a few seconds, and I could feel my breathing getting heavier. Nathan, this isn't right, you understand, I said, but my voice sounded uncertain, as if I didn't believe it myself. He nodded, but didn't remove his hand. I know, but I can't pretend I don't feel it, he replied, and his eyes were so honest I almost choked. I wanted to pull away, to tell him to leave, but instead I leaned closer. Our faces were very close, and I felt the warmth of his breath on my skin. Tell me to stop if you want me to, he whispered, and his voice was low, almost pleading. I opened my mouth but said nothing, and he slowly moved closer still. When his lips touched mine, it was soft, tentative, like he was expecting me to push him away. But I didn't push away, I responded, and everything inside me exploded with the sensation. We pulled away after a moment and I stared at him, trying to figure out what had just happened. Nathan, what are we doing? I asked, and my voice shook with a mixture of fear and something else. He took my hand in his and squeezed it. I don't know, David, but I don't want this to end, he replied, and his words were so simple, so real. I nodded, feeling the warmth of his palm soothe me, and realized that I didn't want to stop either. It had been a week since that night in the kitchen when Nathan had kissed me, and I still couldn't get over it. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the warmth of his lips, his hand on mine, and it drove me crazy. Caroline came home for the weekend, and I tried to act like nothing had happened, asking about her work, making breakfast, even watching some stupid show with her. But inside I was on edge because Nathan was in the next room, and I could catch his eyes through the doorway. On Monday, Caroline left for Seattle again, and the house emptied, leaving Nathan and me alone. I knew we couldn't pretend like nothing had happened, but I was afraid to say it out loud. That evening I was sitting in the living room with a book I hadn't even read when Nathan came down the stairs. He was wearing a sweatshirt and jeans, and his hair was slightly mussed from his shower. David, can I talk to you for a minute? He asked, sitting down on the couch across from me. I set the book aside and nodded, feeling my stomach clench with nerves. "Sure, what do you want to talk about?" I replied, trying to sound calm, even though everything was shaking inside. He looked at me and his eyes were serious, almost anxious. "About what happened in the kitchen, I can't stop thinking about it," he said, and his voice was quiet but firm. I swallowed, not knowing what to say, and just stared at him. "I'm thinking about it too, Nathan, but it's all so complicated," I finally squeezed out, and my words hung in the air between us. He nodded as if he'd expected it, and leaned a little closer. "I know it's wrong, but I don't care, to be honest," he said, and there was so much determination in his voice that I froze. I wanted to object, to remind him about Caroline, about him being her son, but the words stuck in my throat. "We can't just ignore it, can we?" I asked, and my voice sounded tired, like I'd given up. He shook his head and pulled himself closer to me on the couch. "I don't want to ignore, David, I want to be with you," he replied, and his hand lay on mine, squeezing it just like it had then in the kitchen. I felt the warmth of his skin, and all my doubts began to dissolve like sugar in hot tea. We sat in silence for a couple minutes, and I noticed his thumbs stroking my palm. "What are we going to do, Nathan?" "Caroline will notice sooner or later," I said, looking at him and feeling the fear come up again. He shrugged, but his gaze was calm. "We'll be careful, no one will find out unless we want them to," he replied, and his confidence reassured me a little. Then he moved even closer, and I felt the warmth of his shoulder next to mine. "I just want you to be happy, David," he whispered, and his voice was so soft I almost melted. I turned to him and our faces were right next to each other, just like the other night. "You make me happy, Nathan, more than I thought you would," I said, and it was a truth I couldn't hide anymore. He smiled, and his hand moved up to my face, lightly touching my cheek. We kissed again, and this time it wasn't as tentative. I could feel his fingers clutching my sweatshirt, like he was afraid I'd disappear. I responded by putting my hand on his back, and we sat like that, pressed against each other until time lost its meaning. It wasn't just about the kiss, it was about the way it filled the emptiness I'd carried inside me for years. When we pulled away, I looked at him and realized there was no turning back. "We need to keep this a secret, Nathan, for both our sakes," I said, and my voice was serious, almost stern. He nodded, squeezing my hand even tighter. "I'll do everything I can to make it work, I promise you," he answered, and I believed him because I wanted to believe him. For the next few days we were careful: no long stares at dinner, no casual touches if someone might come by. But at night, when the house fell asleep, we found moments to be together. Once he came into my bedroom after midnight and we just lay on the bed, talking in whispers about stuff. His head was on my shoulder, and I could feel the warmth of his breath on my neck. It was the best thing I'd experienced in a long time. But I knew it couldn't last forever. Caroline was due back in a week, and I was afraid she'd see something in my eyes. "What happens when she comes back?" I asked him one night, looking up at the ceiling. He turned to me and took my hand. "We'll figure it out, David, step by step, like we always do," he replied, and I nodded, though I was still uneasy inside. Another week had passed since our conversation on the couch, and Caroline came home from Seattle as promised. I met her at the door with a smile, helped her carry her bags in, and asked her about the trip, but inside I was shrinking with dread. She looked tired but content, and I noticed her cast a quick glance at Nathan, who was sitting in the living room with his laptop. "It's good that you two get along. I feel more comfortable when I'm away," she said as she took off her coat, and I nodded, feeling my palms sweat. The next few days were like walking on thin ice. I tried to be attentive to Caroline, but I couldn't stop thinking about Nathan. He and I kept our distance in front of her. He went to work early, I did chores around the house, and we hardly ever crossed paths. But every time Caroline looked away, I caught his gaze, and it was like an electric shock. I knew it couldn't last much longer, and it gnawed at me from the inside out. One evening, about 3 days after her return, Caroline went to bed early, citing a headache. I was sitting in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, looking out the window at the dark backyard, when I heard footsteps. Nathan came up behind me and put his hand on my shoulder. "Are you okay, David? You're kind of quiet today," he asked in a whisper, and his voice was so soft I almost turned toward him right there. "Just tired, probably thinking too much," I replied, trying not to look at him, but he squeezed my shoulder a little harder. Let's go for a walk. The air is fresh, it'll make you feel better, he suggested, and I nodded because I couldn't say no. We walked out the back door and the cool night wind hit my face, clearing my head a little. The yard was dark, with only the light from the kitchen window falling on the grass, and I could feel Nathan walking beside me, very close. We reached the old shed in the corner of the lot where I kept my lawnmower and junk. It was quiet, only the crickets were chirping somewhere in the bushes, and I stopped, looking at him. Nathan, we can't go on like this, it's too risky, I said, and my voice shook with tension. He took a step towards me and I felt the warmth of his body despite the cold air. I know, but I can't stop, David, he replied, and his hand rested on my waist. We stood against the wall of the barn, hidden from the house by the shadows, and I realized it was useless to resist. He moved closer, and I felt his fingers slide down my back under my jacket. Are you sure no one will see us? I whispered, looking back at the house, but he nodded, snuggling against me. No one will see us, we're careful, he replied, and his voice was low, soothing. I closed my eyes as his lips found mine, and we pressed against each other like it was the last time. His hands moved slowly, hugging me tighter, and I felt the warmth of his breath on my neck as he pulled away from my lips. We didn't say anything, just stood there, pressed against each other, and I could feel his heart beating in unison with mine. It was more than just a moment, it was like a promise that we would find a way to be together. I ran my hand through his hair, and he smiled at me in the darkness, not letting go. But then I heard the house door creak open, and we both froze. It must be Caroline, she could be awake, I whispered, pulling away from him, and my heart raced with panic. Nathan nodded, retreating back towards the barn. Go ahead, I'll come back later and tell you I checked the car, he said quietly, and I ran toward the house, trying to breathe steady. Caroline was standing in the kitchen with a mug of water, looking at me with sleepy eyes. Where have you been? I woke up and you were gone, she asked, and I forced myself to smile. Just getting some air, I said, and she nodded, heading back to the bedroom. I stared after her, feeling the guilt clenching my chest, but I couldn't let go of Nathan. He left for work the next day, and I stayed home, trying to figure out how to move on. Caroline left for Seattle a couple days later, and Nathan and I were alone again, but I knew it couldn't go on. One night I sat down with him in the living room and said, Nathan, we need to stop, this is destroying me. He looked at me and his eyes were full of pain. I don't want to lose you, David, but I understand, he replied, and his voice was so quiet that I almost changed my mind. We decided to keep our distance, and the following weeks were agonizing. I saw him every day, but I couldn't get closer than a couple steps. Eventually Nathan found an apartment in the city after a month and moved in. I helped him pack, and as he drove away, we hugged at the door. You'll always be important to me, David, he said, and I nodded, feeling a lump in my throat. He left and I was left alone, looking at the empty house. I knew it was the right thing to do. And yet I realized that he had awakened something in me that I would carry with me forever. Caroline returned from Seattle a couple days after he'd left, and I tried to behave as usual, cooking dinner, asking about her work, watching the news with her. But every time I walked past his empty room, something inside clenched, and I couldn't ignore it. One Friday night I was sitting in my backyard with a mug of coffee, looking up at the dark sky over Portland. It was cold, but I was wrapped up in an old jacket and just wanted to be alone. Suddenly I heard footsteps at the fence and looked up. It was Nathan, wearing a sweatshirt and carrying a small bag over his shoulder. Hey David, didn't expect me so soon, did you? He said, smiling, and his voice was so familiar I almost spilled my coffee. I stood up, feeling my heart pounding faster than usual. Come on in, I'm glad to see you. What are you doing here? I replied, opening the gate and letting him into the yard. He dropped his bag on the grass and rubbed his hands together from the cold. Was in the neighborhood on business, thought I'd drop by, missed you, he said, and his eyes looked at me in a way that made me freeze. I nodded, not knowing what to say, and offered to come inside, but he shook his head. Let's hang out here, I like this yard with you, he added, and I felt warmth in my chest. We were standing by the old maple tree where it all started a couple months ago, and I noticed him looking at me. Nathan, Are you okay? You seem serious today, I asked, setting the mug on the ground and turning to him. He stepped closer and his hand touched mine, squeezing lightly. I can't forget you, David. These 2 weeks have been hell, he said softly, and his words hit me right in the soul. I swallowed, feeling everything inside turn over, and replied, I've missed you too. I think about you every day. He pulled even closer, and I felt the warmth of his body in the cold air. We can do something. I don't want to lose this, he said, and his voice was full of a hopefulness that ignited something in me. I nodded, not thinking about Caroline or what would happen next. I don't want to either, Nathan, you're too important to me, I replied, and he smiled, hugging me so tightly that I could feel his heart through the sweatshirt. We stood in the shade of a maple tree, hidden from the house, and his hands slid down my back, pulling me closer. You have no idea how much I've been waiting for this, he whispered, and his breath warmed my neck as we pressed against each other. I ran my hand through his hair, feeling its softness, and replied in a whisper, I've been waiting too. You make me alive. It was more than words, it was like a promise, and I didn't want to let him go. His fingers clutched my jacket, and we stood like that, tightly embraced while the wind rustled around us. I felt the warmth of his chest, his hands stroking me through the fabric, and I realized that this was the end of our doubts. We pulled away, but he took my hand and squeezed it. I'll find a way to be there for you, David, I promise, he said, and I believed him because I wanted to believe him. We went back to the house and talked for a while, and he left, but I knew it wasn't over. The next day I sat and thought about what I would tell Caroline when the time came. I knew I wouldn't be able to live the life I had before, and Nathan had given me the courage to admit it. Now I was looking for a way forward, looking for a way to be with him, and I felt like I was choosing myself for the first time. Thank you, friends, for following this story with me to the end. What do you think? Was I right not to let him go? Is it worth risking everything for someone who sees the real you? Write in the comments. I want to know what you think. If you were as hot as I promised, give me a like. It means a lot to me.